The station master's words hit Helena Vance like a slap across the face in the sweltering August heat of 1877, and she felt every eye at the Sacramento depot turn toward her, as he repeated louder this time that she was simply too big to board the passenger car without purchasing 2 seats. The humiliation burned hotter than the California sun beating down on the wooden platform as she stood there clutching her carpetbag, her traveling dress sticking to her skin, watching the other passengers file onto the train while the conductor crossed his arms and refused to let her pass. She had saved for 6 months to afford this single ticket to San Francisco, where a seamstress position awaited her. A chance to finally leave behind the whispers and cruel laughter that had followed her since childhood in this unforgiving town. Now here she was, 23 years old and being told she needed to pay double or step aside. And she had exactly $4.17 left to her name after purchasing what she thought would be enough. "Miss, you are holding up the line," the conductor said, his mustache twitching with impatience. "Either purchase another ticket or move along." Helena felt tears prick at her eyes but refused to let them fall. Not here, not in front of these people who were already staring and murmuring behind their hands. She had endured years of being called fat, of having shop doors close in her face, of watching men look right through her as though she did not exist. Her size had always been the first thing people noticed, the only thing they seemed to see, and it had cost her jobs, friendships, and any hope of romance. She was a large woman, tall and broad with curves that defied the fashionable silhouettes of the day, and she had learned to carry herself with as much dignity as she could muster even when the world seemed determined to strip it away. "I do not have money for another ticket," she said quietly, her voice steady even as her hands trembled. "I was told 1 ticket would suffice." "Then you were told wrong," the conductor replied without sympathy. "Train company policy. Now please step aside." Helena backed away from the train car steps, her face burning as other passengers pushed past her with barely concealed disgust or pity. She watched as the train began to hiss and rumble, preparing for departure, and felt her last hope of escape rolling away with it. San Francisco might as well have been on the moon for all the chance she had of reaching it now. She would have to return to her boarding house and face Mrs. Patterson's knowing looks, would have to write to the seamstress shop and explain why she could not take the position after all, would have to remain in Sacramento, where everyone knew her as that big Vance girl who nobody wanted. "That is a damned shame," a voice said from behind her, deep and warm with a trace of Texas drawl that softened the curse. "That conductor ought to be ashamed of himself, treating a lady that way." Helena turned to find a cowboy standing a few feet away, his hat tilted back to reveal a sun-bronzed face and eyes the color of aged whiskey. He was tall and lean with the sort of ranginess that came from long days in the saddle, wearing dusty trail clothes and spurs that chinked softly as he shifted his weight. His dark hair curled slightly at his collar, and when he smiled at her, there was nothing but genuine kindness in his expression. No judgment or mockery, just concern for a stranger who had been publicly humiliated. "I will manage," Helena said automatically, though she had no idea how that might be true. She was not accustomed to strangers offering sympathy, especially not handsome cowboys who looked like they belonged in a dime novel. "Name is James Jackson," he said, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture of respect. "And I could not help but overhear that unfortunate situation. Where were you headed, if you do not mind my asking?" "San Francisco," Helena replied, wondering why he cared. Men like him never paid her any attention except to laugh or make crude jokes with their friends. She waited for the other boot to drop, for him to reveal whatever cruel punchline this conversation was building toward. "That is quite a journey," James said thoughtfully. He studied her for a moment with those warm eyes, and she felt herself wanting to look away but finding she could not. "I am actually headed in that direction myself. Got a wagon outside loaded with supplies for a ranch out near the coast. It is built to haul freight, plenty of room for a passenger or two. I would be happy to offer you passage if you are willing to trade the speed of a train for the slower pace of a wagon." Helena stared at him, certain she had misheard. "You are offering to take me to San Francisco in your wagon?" "Well, close enough to it anyway," James said with an easy smile. "The ranch I am supplying is about 20 miles from the city proper, but I can get you to a station from there. Take about 3 or 4 days depending on the roads and weather, but it would get you where you are going. And there would be no conductor telling you that you do not fit." The kindness in his voice nearly undid her completely. Helena had grown so accustomed to cruelty that compassion felt almost foreign, and she did not know how to respond to it. Part of her wanted to refuse, to protect herself from whatever disappointment or humiliation surely awaited if she accepted. But a larger part, the part that was tired of being small and invisible despite her size, wanted desperately to say yes. "I could not impose on you like that," she said, though her heart was already reaching for the hope he offered. "It would be no imposition," James assured her. "Honestly, I would welcome the company. Gets lonely on the road, and I have a feeling you would be interesting to talk to. Plus, my wagon is built for hauling freight and can handle any load. Built for two, as they say, even if one of those two happens to be a half-ton of grain sacks or supplies. You would be considerably better company than grain sacks, I can promise you that." There was no mockery in his words, no hidden barb. He was simply stating facts about his wagon's capacity and making a joke to put her at ease. Helena felt something loosen in her chest, some tight knot of shame and hurt that had been there so long she had forgotten what it felt like to breathe without it. "I do not even know you," she said weakly, grasping at the practical concerns even as hope bloomed warm in her chest. "That is true enough," James acknowledged. "But I give you my word as a gentleman that I mean you no harm. We can make whatever arrangements make you comfortable. I can get references if you need them, though most folks I know are back in Texas. Or we can travel during daylight hours only, and I can sleep under the wagon while you sleep in it. Whatever puts your mind at ease." Helena looked at the train pulling away from the station, at the town she had never felt at home in, and then back at this stranger who was offering her kindness without expecting anything in return. It was foolish to trust him. It was dangerous to climb into a wagon with a man she did not know and travel for days across the California countryside. But what was the alternative? Stay in Sacramento and waste away in the boarding house, watching her dreams disappear like morning fog. "Why would you do this for someone you just met?" she asked, needing to understand. James was quiet for a moment, his expression growing serious. "I had a sister once," he said finally. "Rebecca. She was different from other folks, slower in her thinking, and people were not always kind about it. My parents tried to protect her, but the world can be cruel to people it decides do not fit. She took her own life when she was 19 because she could not stand the way people looked at her anymore, the things they said." His voice roughened with old grief. "I swore after that I would never stand by and watch someone be treated poorly just because they are different from what small-minded folks think they should be. So when I see a conductor humiliate a lady who has done nothing wrong, I figure the least I can do is offer an alternative." Helena felt tears slip down her cheeks before she could stop them. Not tears of sadness, but of recognition, of finding someone who understood what it meant to be marked as other, even if only second-hand through loss. She thought of all the times she had wanted to simply disappear, to cease existing rather than face another day of judgment and rejection. She thought of the kindness that had been so rare in her life that she had nearly forgotten what it looked like. "I would be grateful for passage in your wagon," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you, Mr. Jackson." "James, please," he said, and his smile returned like sun breaking through clouds. "Mr. Jackson makes me feel older than my 27 years. Now, let me help you with that bag and we can get you settled. I have the wagon parked just down the street." He reached for her carpetbag and she let him take it, following as he led the way from the depot platform. Sacramento bustled around them with all the chaotic energy of a growing city. Chinese laborers mixing with miners and merchants, horses and wagons clogging the wide dirt streets. The gold rush was more than 20 years past, but the city still carried the restless energy of a place built on dreams and desperation. Helena had lived here for 3 years after leaving the small farming community where she grew up, and she had never felt like she belonged in either place. James's wagon stood in the shade of a large oak tree, and Helena saw immediately what he meant about it being built for freight. It was a sturdy Studebaker with high sides, and a canvas cover stretched over wooden ribs, the kind of wagon made for hauling supplies across rough country. 2 draft horses stood patiently in their traces, massive creatures with gentle eyes and coats the color of copper. The wagon bed was loaded with barrels and crates secured with rope, but there was indeed room for a passenger up on the bench seat, and more room in the back among the cargo. "This here is Thunder and Lightning," James said, gesturing to the horses. "Do not let the dramatic names fool you. They are about as excitable as a pair of old grandmothers, steady and reliable, which is what matters on a long journey." Helena approached the horses cautiously. She had limited experience with such large animals, having grown up in town rather than on a farm. Thunder, or perhaps Lightning, she could not tell which was which, lowered his enormous head and huffed warm breath against her hand when she reached out tentatively. "He likes you," James observed, stowing her carpetbag in the wagon bed. "Animals are good judges of character, I have always found, much better than people." "I am not sure I know how to ride in a freight wagon," Helena admitted, eyeing the high seat. "Nothing to it," James assured her. "Here, let me help you up." He positioned a wooden crate as a step and offered his hand. Helena hesitated, then took it, feeling the strength in his calloused fingers as he steadied her climb. She was not accustomed to men touching her, even in this innocent way, and she was acutely aware of her size as she settled onto the bench seat. But the seat was wide and sturdy, built to accommodate supplies and apparently comfortable enough for a woman of her proportions. James swung up beside her with the easy grace of someone who had made this movement 1,000 times and picked up the reins. "Ready?" he asked, and when she nodded he made a clicking sound with his tongue that set the horses moving. The wagon rolled forward with a gentle sway, and Helena watched Sacramento fall away behind them as they headed west. The afternoon sun blazed down from a cloudless sky, but the wagon's canvas cover provided some shade, and there was a breeze coming in from the direction of the coast. Helena found herself relaxing slightly, her hands loosening their death grip on the edge of the seat. "So tell me," James said as they left the last buildings of the city behind, "what brings you to California? You do not sound like a native." "I am from Illinois originally," Helena replied. "My family moved west when I was 16, settled in a farming town north of here. My parents died of fever 2 years ago within days of each other, and I came to Sacramento to find work. I was told there was a seamstress position in San Francisco, someone who needed help with alterations and repairs. It seemed like an opportunity to start fresh somewhere new. Sacramento was not kind to you, James said, and it was not a question. No town has been kind to me, Helena said honestly. I am too big, you see. Too tall, too heavy, too much space taken up. People do not like that in a woman. They want us small and delicate and quiet. I have never been any of those things. James was silent for a moment, his eyes on the road ahead where brown hills rolled away toward distant mountains. I think there is nothing wrong with taking up space, he said finally. The world is plenty big enough for all of us, whatever size we come in. Folks who tell you otherwise are just trying to make themselves feel bigger by making you feel small. It is a coward's game. Helena felt something warm bloom in her chest at his words. She studied his profile, the strong line of his jaw and the way the sun caught in his dark hair. He was handsome in a rough-hewn way, but more than that he seemed genuine, like he said what he meant without calculation or cruelty. It was so different from what she was used to that she hardly knew how to respond. "You are very kind to say that," she managed. "I am just saying what is true," James replied. "Besides, I have always thought there was something appealing about a woman with substance to her. My mother used to say that people are like trees. Some are willows that bend with every wind, and some are oaks that stand firm no matter the storm. I have always preferred oaks." Helena felt her face heat with something that was not quite embarrassment and not quite pleasure, some unfamiliar emotion that made her heart beat faster. She had never heard a man speak of women like her with anything but disdain or crude humor. The idea that James might find her appealing was so foreign she could barely process it. They traveled in companionable silence for a while, the wagon rolling steadily westward along a well-worn road. The landscape was dry this time of year. The grass on the hills turned golden brown by the long summer. Occasionally they passed other travelers, freight wagons heading east or a stagecoach rattling past in a cloud of dust. James handled the horses with easy competence, his movements economical and sure. As the afternoon wore on, Helena found herself stealing glances at him, curious about this cowboy who had rescued her from humiliation with such casual grace. He had mentioned being from Texas, and there was indeed something of the Lone Star State in his bearing, a sort of relaxed confidence that seemed particularly Texan. His hands on the reins were scarred and calloused, the hands of someone who worked hard for his living, but there was also a gentleness to the way he handled the horses that spoke of kindness. "What brings you to California?" she asked, finding her voice again. "You said you are supplying a ranch." "That is right," James confirmed. "The Circle R Ranch out past the coastal hills. I have been working there for about 3 years now, came out from Texas after the war ended and there was not much left to go back to. The ranch belongs to a man named Robert Richardson. Good man, fair employer. He sends me on supply runs to Sacramento every few months, trusts me to get what is needed and get it back safely." "You fought in the war?" Helena asked, then immediately wished she had not. The war had been over for 12 years, but its wounds still ran deep, and she did not know which side he had fought on or what he had seen. "I did," James said simply. "Not something I am particularly proud of, but I was young and thought it was the right thing to do. Spent 4 years learning that war is mostly just mud and blood and waiting, with occasional moments of pure terror thrown in. I was 16 when I enlisted, 20 when I mustered out, and I came west because there was nothing left of the boy I had been, and I did not know who I was supposed to be as a man. The ranch gave me a place to figure that out. 16 when he enlisted." Helena did a quick calculation and realized that made him about 11 years older than her, though he did not look it. The war had aged some men prematurely, while leaving others seemingly untouched. James seemed to fall somewhere in between, old enough to carry scars but young enough to still smile easily. "I am sorry," she said, "that you had to experience that. We all carry something," James said philosophically. "Trick is not to let it break you. Now, I figure we have about 2 more hours of good light today. There is a spot about 10 miles up the road where travelers often camp, good water and some trees for shade. I was planning to stop there for the night if that suits you." The practical reality of the situation suddenly hit Helena. She was going to spend the night camped alongside the road with a man she had known for less than a day. It was scandalous, the sort of thing that would ruin her reputation if anyone back in Sacramento found out. But then, what reputation did she have to protect? She was already considered unmarriageable, too big and too poor to attract any respectable suitor. Perhaps it was time to stop worrying about propriety and start thinking about survival. "That sounds fine," she said, pushing down the flutter of nervousness in her stomach. They rolled on as the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. The air cooled slightly as evening approached, bringing relief from the day's heat. Helena found herself relaxing into the rhythm of the journey, the steady clop of the horses' hooves and the creak of the wagon wheels becoming almost meditative. When they reached the camping spot James had mentioned, Helena saw that it was a small grove of oak trees clustered around a spring that burbled up from the rocks and collected in a clear pool before flowing away in a narrow creek. Several other groups had already claimed spots under the trees, a family with 3 young children in one area and a pair of minors with a pack mule in another. The presence of other people eased some of Helena's anxiety about the impropriety of the situation. James guided the wagon to a level spot near the edge of the grove and set the brake. "I will tend to the horses and get a fire started if you want to stretch your legs," he said, hopping down from the seat. "There is some bread and cheese in that canvas bag behind the seat, and I have coffee and bacon we can cook once the fire gets going." Helena climbed down from the wagon carefully, her legs stiff from hours of sitting. The ground felt solid and still after the constant motion of travel, and she took a moment to steady herself. Around the grove, other travelers were making camp, the smell of cooking fires beginning to perfume the air. Children's laughter rang out from where the family was settling in, and Helena felt a pang of something she could not quite name, some longing for normalcy and belonging. She watched as James unhitched the horses with practiced efficiency, checking their hooves and rubbing them down with handfuls of dry grass before leading them to the spring to drink. He moved with the unconscious grace of someone completely comfortable with physical labor, and Helena found herself appreciating the way his body moved, the play of muscles beneath his worn shirt. It had been so long since she allowed herself to look at a man with anything like interest that the feeling was almost shocking. By the time the horses were tended and hobbled to graze on the dry grass, James had collected firewood and built a small fire ring with stones. Helena contributed the bread and cheese from the canvas bag, along with a jar of preserves she found wrapped in cloth. James produced a battered coffee pot and a skillet from the wagon storage boxes, along with strips of bacon wrapped in paper. "Not fancy, but it will keep us fed," he said, setting the coffee pot near the coals to heat. They sat on the ground near the fire as the food cooked, the sky overhead deepening from blue to purple as the first stars began to appear. Helena could not remember the last time she had sat beneath the open sky like this, away from the press of buildings and the noise of town life. There was something peaceful about it, something that made her feel smaller in a way that was comforting rather than diminishing. "This is nice," she said softly. Being out here, I mean, away from everything. One of the things I like best about these supply runs, James agreed, turning the bacon in the skillet. Gets me out of the routine, gives me time to think. Ranch life is good, but it can get repetitive, same tasks day after day. This feels like adventure, even if it is just hauling flour and nails. It is certainly an adventure for me, Helena said with a small laugh. This morning I woke up in my boarding house, and now here I am camping under the stars with a cowboy I just met. If you had told me this would happen, I would never have believed it. Life has a way of surprising us, James said, dishing bacon onto tin plates and tearing bread to go with it. Sometimes the surprises are good ones. Here, eat while it is hot. The simple meal tasted better than any fancy restaurant dinner Helena had ever eaten. Maybe it was the fresh air and travel, or maybe it was the company, but the salty bacon and crusty bread seemed like a feast. They ate in comfortable silence, passing the preserves back and forth, and when James poured coffee into enamel cups, the bitter brew tasted perfect in the cooling evening air. "Can I ask you something?" James said after a while, his voice careful. "You do not have to answer if you would rather not." Helena tensed slightly, wondering what he wanted to know. "You can ask. That conductor today, has that happened to you before? Being turned away from places or told you do not fit?" The question was gentle, but it still hurt to consider. Helena stared into her coffee cup, watching the dark liquid reflect the firelight. "More times than I can count," she admitted. "Trains, restaurants, theaters. I once had a shop owner tell me I was blocking too much of the aisle just by standing there. Asked me to leave because I was bad for business. Men make jokes loud enough for me to hear, or place bets on whether I will break a chair when I sit down. Women whisper and thank God they are not like me. It has been my whole life, for as long as I can remember." "That is cruel," James said quietly, "and wrong." "It is just the way things are," Helena said, though the resignation in her voice carried years of hurt. "I learned a long time ago that the world was not made for people like me. I take up too much space, literal and otherwise. The best I can do is try to make myself as small as possible and hope to get by unnoticed. Or you could take up exactly as much space as you need and dare anyone to tell you different," James suggested. "I know that is easy for me to say. I have never walked in your shoes. But it seems to me that spending your life trying to be invisible is no kind of life at all." Helena looked up at him, surprised by the intensity in his voice. The firelight cast his face in warm golden shadow, and she saw nothing but sincerity in his expression. He genuinely meant what he was saying, was not just offering empty platitudes to make her feel better. "I would not know how to do that," she confessed. "Be bold, I mean. Take up space. I have spent so long apologizing for existing that I do not know how to stop." "Maybe that is something you can learn," James said. "Out here, away from all those small-minded people. You do not owe anyone an apology for being who you are, Helena. And anyone who makes you feel like you do is not worth your time or concern." Her name in his mouth sounded different somehow, like it meant something more than just a label. Helena felt her throat tighten with emotion, overwhelmed by his kindness and by the unfamiliar feeling of being seen, truly seen as a person rather than just a problem or a punchline. "Thank you," she whispered, "for saying that, for all of this." "You do not need to thank me," James said softly. "But you are welcome all the same." They finished their meal as full darkness settled over the camp, the fire burning low and other travelers settling in for the night. James showed Helena where she could wash up at the spring, politely turning his back while she refreshed herself with the cool water. When she returned, he had arranged some of the canvas coverings in the wagon bed to make a comfortable sleeping space, padded with a bedroll and a blanket. "You take the wagon," he said when she started to protest. "I have slept under stars more times than I can count. One more night will not hurt me. There is a blanket and you can pull some of that canvas down if it gets cold. Should be comfortable enough." Helena climbed into the wagon bed, finding that he was right about the comfort. The bedroll was worn but clean, and the canvas provided shelter from any evening breeze. She could see James below, rolling out a blanket under the wagon where he would sleep within shouting distance if she needed anything but still maintaining propriety. "James," she called softly into the darkness. "Yes. Why did you really offer to help me today?" "The truth, not just the story about your sister, though I believe that is part of it." There was a long pause before he answered. "Would you believe me if I said that the moment I saw you standing on that platform, refusing to cry even though that conductor was humiliating you, I thought you were the strongest person I had seen in a long time? That there was something about you that made me want to know you better, to be the kind of person worthy of knowing you." Helena's heart hammered in her chest. "I would want to believe it," she whispered. "Then believe it," James said simply, "because it is the truth. Good night, Helena." "Good night, James." She lay in the darkness of the wagon bed, listening to the night sounds of the camp and the quiet breathing of the horses nearby. Overhead through the wagon's opening she could see a vast sweep of stars, more than she had ever seen in town where lamplight washed them out. She thought about James's words, about being strong and taking up space and being worthy of kindness. She thought about the way he looked at her without judgment or pity, just honest appreciation. It was so strange and so wonderful that she barely knew how to process it. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Helena Vance fell asleep with something like hope warming her chest. She woke to the smell of coffee and bacon once again, the early morning light filtering through the canvas in soft gray tones. Outside the wagon she could hear James moving around, talking quietly to the horses. Helena sat up slowly, her body stiff from sleeping in an unfamiliar position, and climbed out of the wagon to find him tending a small breakfast fire. "Morning," he said with a smile. "Sleep well." "Better than I expected," Helena admitted. The morning air was cool and fresh, the grove quiet as other travelers began stirring. She used the spring to wash her face and tidy her hair as best she could without a proper mirror, feeling somewhat self-conscious about her appearance after sleeping in her clothes. They ate a quick breakfast and were on the road again by the time the sun cleared the eastern hills. The second day of travel settled into a rhythm similar to the first, the wagon rolling steadily westward while they talked or sat in companionable silence. Helena found herself relaxing more completely, enjoying the journey despite its discomforts. James was easy to be with, requiring no performance or pretense, content to let conversation flow naturally without forcing it. Around midday, they stopped at a small settlement that barely qualified as a town, just a general store and a blacksmith clustered around a crossroads. James needed to pick up some additional supplies and suggested Helena might want to stretch her legs. While he conducted his business, Helena wandered to the edge of the settlement where a small church stood, its white paint peeling in the harsh California sun. She was standing in the shade of the church, looking out at the rolling hills, when a woman's voice spoke behind her. "You traveling through?" Helena turned to find a woman about her mother's age would have been, wearing a simple calico dress and carrying a basket of eggs. Her face was weathered by sun and hard work, but her eyes were kind. "Yes, madam," Helena replied, "headed towards San Francisco." "Long journey," the woman observed. "You traveling alone?" "With a companion," Helena said carefully, aware of how that might sound. "A gentleman who offered me passage in his wagon after I missed the train." The woman's eyebrows rose slightly, but she did not seem judgmental, just curious. Well, you seem like a sensible girl. I hope your companion is treating you respectfully. He is, Helena assured her. Very much so. He has been nothing but kind. That is good, the woman said. Not all men are, especially out here where law is sometimes more suggestion than reality. You be careful, dear. A woman alone or near enough to alone has to protect herself. I will, Helena promised, touched by the stranger's concern. Thank you. The woman nodded and moved on toward the general store, and Helena stood in the shade thinking about her words. It was true that she was taking a risk traveling with James, trusting a stranger with her safety and her reputation. But something in her gut told her that he was trustworthy, that his kindness was genuine rather than calculated. She had to believe that instinct, because the alternative was to refuse all help and remain stuck forever in the small, cruel world she had known. James emerged from the general store carrying several packages, which he stowed carefully in the wagon. Ready to push on? He asked, and when Helena nodded, he helped her back onto the seat. The afternoon grew hot as they traveled through increasingly dry country, the hills turning from gold to brown. James pointed out landmarks, telling stories about previous trips and the characters he had met along the way. He had a gift for storytelling, bringing people to life with a few well-chosen details, and a good sense of comic timing. Helena found herself laughing more than she had in months, her sides aching with it as he recounted a particularly disastrous encounter with a temperamental mule. I swear that animal had it in for me from the start, James said, his eyes crinkling with amusement at the memory. Kicked over the water bucket twice, stepped on my foot, and then had the audacity to try to bite me when I finally got him loaded. The rancher just laughed and said the mule was a good judge of character, which I did not appreciate at all. Maybe you deserved it, Helena teased, surprising herself with her own boldness. Maybe you insulted his mother or something. I might have suggested he was the ugliest mule I had ever seen, James admitted. But I maintain that was just honest observation, not insult. They camped that night beside a dry creek bed, no other travelers in sight. The isolation felt different from the previous night's grove, more intimate somehow, just the two of them and the horses and the vast, empty landscape. James made dinner while Helena attempted to help, though she had limited cooking skills and mostly just got in his way. He bore her assistance with good humor, showing her how to tend the coffee without letting it boil over and how to judge when the biscuits baking in the covered skillet were done. You really have never cooked over an open fire? He asked, not critically but with genuine curiosity. Never had occasion to, Helena admitted. In town there are always stoves, and before that my mother did most of the cooking. I can sew nearly anything, but cooking was never my strength. Well, trail cooking is different anyway, James said. Simpler but also trickier because you cannot control the heat the same way. Here, try flipping this biscuit. He handed her the long fork and guided her hand, showing her how to slide it under the biscuit and turn it without breaking the delicate crust. His hand was warm over hers, calloused and strong, and Helena was acutely aware of the contact even though it was perfectly innocent. When the biscuit flipped successfully, she felt a ridiculous surge of pride. There, you are a trail cook now, James declared. Few more days and you will be ready to hire on with a cattle drive. I think I will stick with sewing, Helena laughed, but thank you for the lesson. After dinner, they sat by the fire again, talking about everything and nothing. James told her about the Circle R Ranch, about the rhythm of ranch life and the characters who worked there. He spoke with obvious affection about his boss, Robert Richardson, and the man's wife, Margaret, who apparently treated James like a son. Helena told him about her dream of being a seamstress, about the satisfaction she found in taking fabric and creating something beautiful and useful with just needle and thread. I love that moment when you finish a piece and it comes out exactly as you envisioned it, she said, her voice animated with passion. Or even better, when it surprises you and turns out better than you planned. There is something almost magical about it, taking something flat and shapeless and giving it dimension and purpose. That is how I feel about working with horses, James said. Taking an animal that is all wild energy and nerves and teaching it to trust you, to work with you as a partner. It is not about breaking their spirit, whatever some cowboys might say. It is about building a relationship, earning their confidence. When you get it right, when a horse responds to you because it wants to rather than because it is afraid, that is magic. Helena looked at him across the fire, this cowboy who spoke about magic and relationships and earning trust, and felt something shift in her chest. She was starting to realize that what she felt for James was more than gratitude or friendship. She was attracted to him, drawn to his kindness and his strength, and the way he made her feel seen and valued. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once, this feeling she had thought she would never experience. "Can I ask you something?" she said before she lost her nerve. "Anything." "Have you ever been married? Or engaged? You are 27, I would think someone would have claimed you by now." James smiled ruefully. "Almost once. There was a girl back in Texas before the war. Her name was Sarah and we had an understanding, or so I thought. But while I was off fighting, she married someone else, a man who stayed home and built a business while I was sleeping in trenches. I was angry about it for a long time, felt betrayed. But looking back, I think maybe we were just too young, and the war changed me into someone she would not have recognized anyway." "Do you regret it? Fighting, I mean." "I regret the fighting itself," James said carefully. "All the death and suffering, but I do not regret who it made me eventually. I had to walk through fire to get here, but I like the man I became on the other side. And if I had stayed in Texas and married Sarah, I would be living a different life, not necessarily a better one. Certainly not one that would have brought me to a Sacramento train depot at exactly the right moment to meet you." The weight of that statement hung between them, full of implication and possibility. Helena felt her breath catch in her throat, afraid to hope but unable to stop herself. "You make it sound like fate," she said softly. "Maybe it was," James replied. "I have hauled supplies to Sacramento a dozen times in the last 3 years. I could have been there any day, any week, but I was there on that particular afternoon when you needed help. Makes you wonder if there is not some design to things, some pattern we cannot see." "I want to believe that," Helena said, "but I have spent so long feeling like the universe was against me that it is hard to imagine it might actually be on my side." "Maybe it just took a while to line things up right," James suggested. "All the pieces had to be in place. You had to save enough money for a ticket, had to be brave enough to buy it and show up at that station. That conductor had to be enough of a coward to humiliate you publicly. I had to finish loading my wagon and decide to leave that particular afternoon rather than morning. Any one of those things happens different and we never meet. But they did not happen different. They happened exactly the way they did, and here we are." "Here we are," Helena echoed, looking at him across the fire and feeling like she was standing on the edge of something vast and unknown. "James, I need you to know something. I am not good at this, at talking to men or understanding what they want or mean. I have no experience with any of it. So if I am misunderstanding what is happening between us, if I am reading things into your kindness that are not there, please tell me now before I make a fool of myself." James stood up and walked around the fire to sit beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his body in the cooling night air. He took her hand in his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. "You are not misunderstanding," he said quietly. Helena, I have been trying to figure out how to tell you that I am half in love with you already, after just 2 days. I know that sounds insane, and maybe it is, but it is also true. There is something about you, your strength and your honesty, and the way you laugh when something genuinely delights you. The way you are so careful not to be a burden, so determined to manage on your own even when you are hurting. The way you look at the world like you are still finding beauty in it, despite everything that has tried to convince you there is none. I have never met anyone like you, and I do not want to let you go. Helena felt tears spilling down her cheeks, but for once, they were not tears of shame or hurt. They were tears of overwhelming relief and joy, the feeling of being wanted for the first time in her life. James reached up and gently wiped the tears away with his thumb, his touch achingly tender. "I do not know how to be what you need," she whispered. "I have never been loved. I do not know what that looks like or how to do it right." "Neither of us knows," James said. "That is what makes it an adventure. We will figure it out together, make mistakes and learn from them and try again. But Helena, if you feel even a fraction of what I am feeling, then we owe it to ourselves to try." "I feel it," Helena said, her voice breaking. "I feel so much I do not know what to do with it all. I am terrified you are going to wake up tomorrow and realize you made a mistake, that I am not worth this." "You are worth everything," James said fiercely, "and I am not going anywhere. We have 2 more days on the road to the ranch, and when we get there I am going to talk to Robert about a job for you if you want one. Margaret is always looking for help with mending and sewing, and there is a small cottage on the property that nobody uses. Or if you would rather continue to San Francisco, I will take you there and visit as often as I can. But I need you to know that this is not just some passing fancy. I am serious about you, about us." Helena looked into his eyes and saw nothing but sincerity and hope, and a reflection of her own wild tangle of emotions. Before she could talk herself out of it, before fear could stop her, she leaned forward and kissed him. It was awkward and unpracticed, because she had never kissed anyone before. But James responded with gentle enthusiasm, his hand coming up to cup her cheek as he deepened the kiss. It was nothing like the cold business she had always imagined physical affection must be. It was warm and sweet and made her whole body feel like it was glowing from the inside out. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathing hard, and James rested his forehead against hers. "That was my first kiss," Helena admitted breathlessly. "I probably did it wrong." "It was perfect," James assured her, "and we have all the time in the world to practice." They sat together by the dying fire, Helena tucked against James's side with his arm around her shoulders, and talked about possibilities and futures. It felt surreal, going from resigned loneliness to this breathless hope in the span of just 2 days, but Helena found herself believing in it despite her fears. James made her believe, with his steady presence and his unwavering conviction that they were meant to find each other. Eventually, they separated to sleep, propriety still demanding some distance, even though Helena would have been happy to fall asleep in his arms. But she carried the warmth of his embrace into her bedroll and fell asleep with her fingers touching her lips, remembering the feel of his kiss. The 3rd day of travel dawned clear and slightly cooler, the wind shifting to blow in from the coast. James said they were getting close to the ocean now, though it was still hidden beyond the coastal mountains. The landscape was changing, becoming greener and more lush as they climbed into the hills. Oak and pine trees appeared alongside the road, and the air had a different quality to it, slightly damp and heavy with growing things. Helena felt different too, like kissing James had unlocked something inside her that had been shut away for years. She caught herself smiling for no reason, humming as the wagon rolled along, feeling genuinely happy in a way she had almost forgotten was possible. James caught her eye and grinned, clearly pleased by her good mood. "You look happy," he observed. "I am," Helena said simply. "Happier than I have been in a very long time, maybe ever." "Good," James said. "You deserve to be happy, Helena. You deserve every good thing." They stopped at midday beside a clear stream that tumbled down from the mountains, cold and fresh. While James tended to the horses, Helena wandered upstream a little, delighting in the green ferns and wildflowers that grew along the bank. She found a spot where the stream widened into a pool, the water clear enough to see smooth stones on the bottom. She was standing there, her shoes off and her skirts hiked up, wading in the shallows when James found her. "You look like a girl in a fairy story," he said, leaning against a tree and watching her with obvious appreciation. "A water spirit or something." "I feel like a girl in a story," Helena admitted. "None of this seems quite real yet. I keep expecting to wake up and find I am still at the boarding house, still stuck in Sacramento with no prospects and no hope." "It is real," James assured her. "I promise you that. Come here." Helena waded out of the stream and went to him, her feet still bare and wet. James took both her hands and pulled her close, kissing her with the same sweetness as the night before, but with an added intensity that made her knees weak. She wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him back, pouring all her hope and fear and desperate affection into it. "Marry me," James said when they came up for air, the words tumbling out like he could not hold them back. "I know it is too fast. I know we have only known each other 3 days, but Helena, I have never been more certain of anything in my life. Marry me. Come to the ranch, be my wife. Let me spend the rest of my life proving to you that you are cherished and valued and loved." Helena stared at him, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. Part of her wanted to say yes immediately, to grab this offer of happiness with both hands and never let go. But another part, the part that had been hurt so many times, whispered that it could not be real, that he would change his mind once the novelty wore off. "James, you barely know me," she said, trying to inject some reason into the moment even as her heart screamed at her to accept. "What if you wake up in a month or a year and realize you made a mistake? What if your friends laugh at you for marrying someone like me, someone too big and too plain? What if you come to resent me?" "None of that is going to happen," James said firmly. "Helena, I know my own mind. I have been on my own since I was 16 years old, have made my way through war and hard country and come out the other side. I know what I want and I know what matters. You matter. This matters. I'm not asking you to marry me because I am swept up in some romantic fantasy. I am asking because you are strong and kind and genuine, because you make me laugh and make me think, because when I look at you I see a future I actually want to live. Please, say yes. Take a chance on me the way I am asking you to take a chance on yourself." Helena looked at him, at the sincerity blazing in his eyes, and felt the last of her defenses crumble. He was offering her everything she had ever wanted and told herself she could never have. He was asking her to be brave, to believe that she was worthy of love and happiness. How could she say no to that? How could she let fear rob her of this one perfect chance? "Yes," she whispered, and then louder with more conviction. "Yes, I will marry you." James whooped and picked her up, spinning her around despite her protests about her size. He was strong enough to lift her easily, and the joy on his face was so pure and unrestrained that Helena found herself laughing helplessly, dizzy with happiness, and the spinning and the sheer impossibility of it all. When he finally set her down, they were both grinning like fools, and James kissed her again, long and deep and full of promise. Helena kissed him back without hesitation, without shame, claiming this moment and this man and the future he was offering. "We will get married as soon as we get to the ranch," James said, his forehead pressed to hers. "Robert knows a circuit preacher who comes through every few weeks. Or if you want something bigger, we can wait and do it properly in town with witnesses and a party." "I do not need something big," Helena said. "I just need you, and someone to speak the words that make it official. Everything else is just decoration." "I will get you a ring," James promised. "Nothing fancy, I do not have much saved, but something to show the world you are mine and I am yours." "I do not need a ring either," Helena said, though her heart swelled at the thought. "But I will not say no if you want to get one." They made their way back to the wagon in a daze, hands clasped together, stopping every few feet to kiss again because they could not seem to help themselves. The horses looked on with patient disinterest, and when James finally pulled himself together enough to get them moving again, Helena could not stop smiling. The rest of the journey passed in a blur of planning and dreaming and stolen kisses whenever they stopped. They talked about the cottage James had mentioned, about how they would furnish it and make it a home. James described the ranch and the people there, trying to prepare Helena for her new life. She told him about her skills with a needle, about the kinds of sewing and mending she could do, and he assured her that Margaret Richardson would be thrilled to have her help. "She has been trying to get me married off for 2 years, James admitted with a grin. "Keeps inviting daughters of neighboring ranchers to dinner and trying to arrange situations where I will be alone with them. She is going to be beside herself when I show up with a fiancé." "What if she does not like me?" Helena asked, sudden anxiety gripping her. "She is going to love you," James said with absolute confidence. "Margaret is one of the kindest women I have ever known, and she has no patience for people who judge others by appearances. Besides, once she sees how happy you make me, that will be all that matters to her." They spent their last night on the road camped in a small valley, the air sweet with the scent of wildflowers and ocean salt carried on the breeze. They were close enough to the coast now that the climate had changed noticeably, everything green and alive in a way that the inland valleys were not. James said they would reach the ranch by mid-afternoon the next day. "Are you nervous?" he asked as they sat by the fire, Helena tucked against his side in a way that was becoming wonderfully familiar. "Terrified," Helena admitted, "but in a good way, I think. Everything is changing so fast I can barely keep up with it. But I would rather be terrified moving forward with you than safe and miserable staying where I was." "That is my brave girl," James said, kissing the top of her head. "We are going to be so happy together, Helena. I am going to spend every day making sure you know how loved you are. Just be yourself," Helena said softly. "That is all I need. Someone who sees me as I am and does not wish I was something different." "I see you," James promised. "Every magnificent inch of you. And I would not change a single thing." They held each other as the fire burned down to embers, talking quietly about their hopes and dreams. James told her about his plans to eventually buy his own small spread. Not a huge ranch, but something manageable. A place where they could raise horses and maybe a few cattle. Helena told him about her dream of one day having a real sewing room, with good light and space to work on bigger projects. They wove their individual futures into something shared, something that felt solid and real despite how quickly it was all happening. The next morning brought fog rolling in from the ocean, thick and cool and smelling of salt water. James said it was typical for this close to the coast, and that it would burn off by afternoon. They ate a quick breakfast and were on the road early, both eager to reach their destination. The ranch came into view just after noon, a sprawling collection of buildings nestled in a green valley with hills rising on 3 sides and the ocean visible as a silver gleam in the distance. There was a main house, a barn, several outbuildings, and a handful of small cottages. Cattle grazed in the near pastures and horses ran in a large corral. It looked prosperous and well kept, exactly the kind of place James had described. As the wagon rolled up the long drive, people began emerging from various buildings, calling out greetings. A tall man with graying hair and a weathered face came out of the barn, grinning broadly when he saw James. "About time you got back," the man called. "Was starting to think you got lost or ran off with the supply money." "Never fear, Robert," James called back. "Got everything on the list and then some. But I also brought back something that was not on the list. Actually, someone." He pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the main house and jumped down, then turned to help Helena descend. She was acutely aware of all the eyes on her, people stopping their work to stare at the strange woman climbing out of James's wagon. Her old insecurities came rushing back, the familiar fear that these people would judge her and find her wanting. But then James took her hand firmly in his and stood tall beside her, his pride and affection obvious, and Helena found the courage to lift her head and meet those stares directly. "Robert, Margaret, everyone," James said, his voice carrying across the yard. "This is Helena Vance, and she has agreed to be my wife." There was a moment of stunned silence, and then chaos erupted. A small woman with graying brown hair and a face full of laugh lines came flying out of the house, shrieking with joy. She grabbed James in a fierce hug and then turned to Helena, looking her up and down with eyes that missed nothing. "Well, James Jackson," Margaret Richardson said, her voice warm with approval and amusement, "you certainly do not do anything by half measures, do you? Gone 4 days and come back engaged. Let me look at you, dear." She took Helena's hands and studied her with the same thorough attention, and Helena forced herself not to flinch away from the scrutiny. But what she saw in Margaret's face was not judgment but genuine welcome and curiosity. "You are a handsome woman," Margaret said finally. "Strong-looking, like you can handle hard work and hard times. Good bones, good eyes. I can see why James fell for you. Welcome to the Circle R, Helena. I hope you are ready for an adventure because life with this one is never boring." "Thank you, madam," Helena said, her voice slightly unsteady with relief. "I am looking forward to it." Robert Richardson had approached during this exchange, and now he clapped James on the shoulder with obvious affection. "Married," he said, shaking his head in wonder. "Never thought I would see the day. Congratulations, both of you. Helena, welcome to the family. Any woman who can get this stubborn cowboy to settle down has my respect." Other ranch hands crowded around, offering congratulations and curious questions. They were all men, ranging from young to old, weathered by sun and work. Helena was relieved to see that while they looked at her with curiosity, there was no mockery in their eyes, just the frank interest of people meeting someone new. All right, give them some air," Margaret said, shooing the men back to their work. "James, you get that wagon unloaded and take care of your horses. Helena, you come with me. I want to hear the whole story of how this happened, and then we need to figure out where you are going to sleep until we can get you married proper. Cannot have you two bunking together before the ceremony, no matter how modern people think they are." James shot Helena an apologetic look, but she waved him off, understanding that Margaret was right about propriety. She followed the older woman into the ranch house, a comfortable sprawling structure with wide windows and solid furniture that spoke of years of use. Margaret led her to a cozy kitchen that smelled of bread and coffee and gestured for her to sit at the long wooden table. "Now," Margaret said, pouring 2 cups of coffee and settling across from Helena, "tell me everything. How did you meet my boy, and how in the world did he convince you to marry him in less than a week?" Helena told the story, starting with the humiliation at the train station and ending with James's proposal by the stream. Margaret listened with her full attention, her expressive face showing delight and sympathy and approval at all the right moments. When Helena finished, Margaret reached across the table and patted her hand. "That conductor ought to be ashamed of himself," she said firmly. "But I suppose we should thank him for his cruelty, since it brought you and James together. That boy has been alone too long, keeping everyone at arm's length and pretending he does not need anybody. I have been praying for years that he would find someone who could reach past those walls he built around himself. Sounds like you knocked them right down." "I did not do anything special," Helena protested. "James is the one who offered to help when nobody else would. I just accepted his kindness." "You did more than that," Margaret said wisely. "You let yourself be seen, let yourself be vulnerable. That takes courage, especially after being hurt the way you have been. James recognizes courage when he sees it, has plenty of his own. You two are going to be good for each other, I can tell." "I hope so," Helena said softly. "I am still afraid I am going to wake up and find this was all a dream." "It is real," Margaret assured her. "And you are going to be very happy here. Now, practical matters. You can stay in the guest room here in the main house until the wedding. I will need a day or two to get that cottage James mentioned cleaned out and made livable, but it will be ready by the time you are married. We have a circuit preacher who comes through every 3 weeks or so. He was here 2 weeks ago, which means he should be back in about a week. That gives us time to make some preparations, get you a dress if you want one." "I can make my own dress," Helena said, "if you have fabric and a sewing machine." "I have both," Margaret said with obvious delight. "Oh, this is wonderful. I have been looking for someone to help with mending for ages. The men go through clothes like you would not believe, always tearing things or wearing out seams. And I am getting too old to keep up with it all. If you are willing to take on some of that work, I can pay you fair wages, give you some independence until you and James get settled." "I would be happy to help," Helena said, feeling tears prick at her eyes again. Everything was falling into place so perfectly it seemed impossible, but here it was happening anyway. Margaret showed her to the guest room, a small space but clean and comfortable with a real bed and a window looking out over the ranch yard. Helena could see James below, unloading the wagon with help from several other ranch hands. He looked up as if sensing her gaze and waved, his face splitting into that brilliant smile that made her heart race. "He really loves you," Margaret said from the doorway. "I can see it written all over him. That boy has kept his heart locked up tight since the war, and I had started to worry he would never open it again. Whatever you did, however you managed it, thank you. You gave him back his hope." "He gave me mine too," Helena said softly. "I had stopped believing I could ever be happy, that anyone would ever want me. And then there he was, offering me everything I had stopped letting myself dream about." "That is how the best love stories work," Margaret said with a knowing smile. "Two people finding each other exactly when they need each other most. Now you rest up from your journey and I will call you when dinner is ready. We eat together, everyone at the ranch, big family-style meal. You will get to meet everyone properly." Dinner that evening was indeed a large affair, the long dining table in the ranch house filled with ranch hands and staff. There were 10 men in total, ranging from a teenager named Tom who could not have been more than 15 to an older man called Pete who looked to be in his 60s. They all welcomed Helena with varying degrees of enthusiasm and curiosity, and she found herself relaxing as the meal progressed and conversation flowed around her. James sat beside her, his hand occasionally finding hers under the table in reassuring squeezes. She was grateful for his solid presence, the way he included her in conversations and made it clear to everyone that she belonged here. After dinner, some of the men brought out instruments, a fiddle and a guitar, and played while others sang. It was warm and lively and unlike anything Helena had experienced, this sense of community and belonging. Later, James walked her back to the main house in the twilight, their fingers intertwined. "What do you think?" he asked anxiously. "Is it too rough? Too isolated? Tell me honestly, Helena. If this is not what you want, if you would rather go to San Francisco, I will understand." "It is perfect," Helena said honestly. "Everyone has been so kind, so welcoming, and Margaret is wonderful. I think I am going to love it here, James. It already feels more like home than anywhere I have lived." James stopped walking and pulled her into his arms, kissing her with fierce relief and joy. "I was so worried you would hate it," he admitted. "The ranch is my home, but it is not fancy, not cultured like a city. I know it is asking a lot for you to adjust to this life." "You are not asking too much," Helena assured him. "You are giving me everything. A home, a family, work I enjoy, and most importantly, you. I could not ask for anything more." They stood in the gathering darkness, holding each other close, and Helena thought about how much her life had changed in just a few short days. From humiliation and hopelessness to this, to love and acceptance and a future bright with possibility. It was almost too much to process, but she let herself sink into the reality of it, let herself believe it was truly happening. The next week passed in a blur of activity as Helena settled into ranch life and preparations for the wedding proceeded. Margaret put her to work immediately with a huge pile of mending, and Helena happily spent her days in the sewing room Margaret set up for her in a corner of the house. The work was satisfying and familiar, and she took pride in repairing torn shirts and worn trousers so skillfully that the men's were nearly invisible. In the evenings, James would finish his work and come find her, and they would walk together around the ranch or sit on the porch talking. He showed her everything: the barn where the horses were stabled, the corrals where they broke and trained new animals, the far pastures where cattle grazed. Helena learned the rhythms of ranch life, the early mornings and hard work and satisfaction of tangible accomplishment. She also got to know the other people on the ranch. Tom, the youngest hand, was shy but eager to help, always jumping up to carry things for her or hold doors. Pete, the oldest, told long, rambling stories about the old days and the changes he had seen in California. The other men treated her with respectful friendliness, clearly taking their cue from James's obvious devotion. Margaret became a friend and mentor, teaching Helena about ranch cooking and management while also sharing stories about James's years on the Circle R. Helena learned that he had arrived broken and haunted from the war, that it had taken years for him to learn to smile again and trust people. She learned about his patience with horses and his absolute reliability, the way he could always be counted on to do what needed doing without complaint or excuses. "He has been like a son to Robert and me," Margaret said one afternoon as they worked together in the kitchen. "We never had children of our own, so the men who work here become our family. But James especially, he needed family more than most. I am so glad he found you, Helena. He needs someone to love him the way he deserves to be loved." "I do love him," Helena said, no longer shy about admitting it. "More than I knew it was possible to love someone. He saved my life in more ways than just offering me a ride in his wagon." "And you saved his," Margaret said simply. "That is what the best marriages are built on, two people saving each other over and over again." Helena also spent time working on her wedding dress, using fabric Margaret had bought years ago and never found use for. It was a simple design, nothing fancy, but she made it with meticulous care, wanting it to be perfect. The dress was made to fit her body as it was, emphasizing her curves rather than trying to hide them, with a fitted bodice and a full skirt that she embroidered with delicate flowers along the hem. When she tried it on the night before the wedding, Margaret actually teared up. "You are beautiful," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "James is going to lose his mind when he sees you." The wedding day dawned clear and warm, perfect weather for the small ceremony they had planned. The circuit preacher arrived in the morning, a jovial man named Reverend Thomas, who seemed delighted to be performing a wedding rather than his usual circuit of preaching to small congregations. The ceremony would take place in the afternoon in the ranch's small chapel, which was really just a converted barn building with benches and a simple altar. Helena dressed with Margaret's help, her hands shaking slightly as they fastened the buttons up her back. This was real. She was actually going to marry James Jackson, the cowboy who had rescued her with a wagon built for freight and a heart big enough to see past her size to the woman beneath. It still seemed like something out of a dream. "Ready?" Margaret asked, placing a small wreath of wildflowers on Helena's head. "Yes," Helena said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. The chapel was filled with everyone from the ranch, all dressed in their Sunday best. Someone had decorated with more wildflowers and pine boughs, making the simple space feel festive. But Helena barely noticed any of it because James stood at the altar in a new shirt and clean trousers, his hair combed and his face clean shaven, looking at her like she was the most precious thing he had ever seen. Robert walked her down the short aisle, having offered his arm with gruff kindness when he learned she had no family to perform the duty. Helena barely felt her feet moving, too focused on James's face, on the way his eyes filled with tears when she reached him. "You are so beautiful," he whispered, and she believed him because she could see the truth of it in his eyes. Reverend Thomas performed the ceremony with warmth and humor, speaking about love and partnership and the blessings of finding the right person to share your life with. When he asked if they had rings, James produced a simple gold band, nothing fancy but solid and real. "This is all I could afford on short notice," he said apologetically as he slipped it on her finger. "But I promise you that it represents everything I have to give. My heart, my loyalty, my love, for as long as I live." "It is perfect," Helena said, her voice breaking. "You are perfect." They spoke their vows, promising to love and honor each other through whatever life brought their way. When Reverend Thomas finally told James he could kiss his bride, he did so with tender enthusiasm, cupping Helena's face in his hands and kissing her like she was infinitely precious. The assembled guests cheered and whistled, and Helena felt herself blushing but could not stop smiling. They were married. She was Helena Jackson now, wife of the man she loved, part of this community that had welcomed her so completely. It was real and it was hers, and she was going to hold on to it with everything she had. The celebration afterward was boisterous and joyful, with food and music and dancing. James led Helena in an awkward waltz in the barn, neither of them particularly graceful, but both laughing too hard to care. Everyone wanted to offer congratulations and well wishes, and Helena accepted them all with gratitude and disbelief that this was her life now. As the sun began to set, James and Helena slipped away from the party, walking hand in hand to the cottage that had been cleaned and prepared for them. It was small but charming, with a main room that served as both living space and kitchen, a separate bedroom, and a tiny room that Margaret had suggested could be a sewing room for Helena. Someone had stocked the kitchen with basic supplies, and there was firewood stacked neatly by the stove. "Our home," James said, pulling Helena close. "What do you think?" "I think it is the most beautiful place I have ever seen," Helena said honestly. It was not objectively beautiful, just a simple cottage, but it represented everything she had dreamed of and thought she would never have. It was safety and belonging and love made manifest in wood and stone. James kissed her softly, then with increasing passion as she responded. They made their way to the bedroom, fumbling with buttons and laces, both nervous because neither had much experience but eager to finally consummate their marriage. What they lacked in skill they made up for in enthusiasm and tenderness, James murmuring constant reassurances about how beautiful she was, how much he desired her, how lucky he was to call her his wife. Helena had been terrified that this part of marriage would be disappointing or painful, but with James, it was neither. It was awkward at times, and they had to figure out what worked for both of them, but it was also deeply satisfying in ways she had not anticipated. Being desired, being touched with such obvious appreciation and care, was a revelation. James made her feel beautiful and wanted in a way that went beyond physical pleasure into something almost spiritual. Afterward they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, Helena's head on James's chest and his arms around her. "I love you," he said into her hair. "I know I have said it before, but I need you to know I mean it with everything I am. You are my heart, Helena, my home." "I love you too," Helena said, the words coming easily now. "Thank you for seeing me when nobody else would. Thank you for offering me your wagon and your heart and your life." "Best thing I ever did," James murmured, already sounding sleepy. "Luckiest man alive." They fell asleep wrapped in each other, warm and content and absolutely certain they had made the right choice in betting everything on this wild, improbable love. Life on the ranch settled into a rhythm over the following weeks and months. Helena took over all the mending and sewing work, and word spread to neighboring ranches about her skill. Soon she was taking on commissioned work, making shirts and dresses for people throughout the area, and earning enough money to feel genuinely independent. She and James turned the cottage into a real home, adding touches and comforts as they could afford them. Their marriage deepened and matured as they learned each other's rhythms and quirks. They had arguments occasionally, usually about practical matters like money or whose turn it was to do certain chores, but they learned to talk through disagreements rather than letting resentment build. James was endlessly patient with Helena's occasional moments of insecurity when her old fears would resurface, always quick to reassure her that he loved her and wanted her exactly as she was. Helena bloomed under his constant affection and support, growing more confident and comfortable in her own skin. She stopped apologizing for taking up space, stopped hunching her shoulders trying to make herself smaller. She learned to ride a horse despite her size, with James teaching her on a sturdy mare named Buttercup, who did not care how much her rider weighed. She learned to cook over the temperamental cottage stove, and to bake bread that James declared was better than Margaret's, though both women knew he was exaggerating out of marital loyalty. As fall turned to winter and then to spring, Helena realized that she had not thought about Sacramento or her old life in months. This was her life now, full and rich and satisfying in ways she had never imagined possible. She had friends in Margaret and several of the ranch wives from neighboring properties. She had meaningful work that challenged and fulfilled her. She had a husband who loved her devotedly and made her laugh every single day. One evening in early spring, almost a year after their wedding, Helena realized that her monthly courses had not come when expected. She waited another week before saying anything, not wanting to get James's hopes up in case she was wrong. But when 2 weeks passed with no sign, she finally worked up the courage to tell him. "James," she said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, "I think I might be pregnant." His head whipped around to stare at her, his eyes wide with shock and hope. "Pregnant, are you sure?" "Not completely," Helena admitted. "But all the signs are there. I will need to see a doctor to be certain, but I think we are going to have a baby." James let out a whoop and grabbed her, spinning her around before remembering himself and setting her down carefully. "A baby," he said, his voice full of wonder. "Helena, we are going to have a baby. This is incredible, amazing. When, how long? If I am right, probably late autumn," Helena said, laughing at his excitement. "But James, I am nervous. What if I am not a good mother? What if something goes wrong?" "You are going to be an amazing mother," James said fiercely. "And nothing is going to go wrong because I am going to take care of you every single day. We are going to be so careful. You are carrying the most precious thing in the world." They told Robert and Margaret that evening, and Margaret cried happy tears and immediately began making plans. She insisted that Helena see the doctor in the nearest town as soon as possible, and sure enough, the doctor confirmed what Helena had suspected. She was about 2 months along, healthy and strong, and if she took reasonable care, she should have no problems carrying to term. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the spring and summer. Helena continued her sewing work, her expanding belly just making it more challenging to reach the machine pedals, but not impossible. James was comically overprotective, trying to prevent her from doing any heavy lifting or strenuous activity, until Helena finally had to sit him down and explain that pregnant women had been managing regular work for all of human history, and she was not going to break. "I am nervous," James admitted. "My mother lost 2 babies between me and my sister Rebecca, and Rebecca's death nearly destroyed her. I could not bear it if something happened to you or the baby." "Nothing is going to happen," Helena said firmly, taking his hand and placing it on her swelling belly where the baby had started to kick. "Feel that. That is a strong, healthy baby in there. We are both going to be fine, James. You need to trust me and trust this." The baby arrived on a cool October evening, almost exactly a year and a half after that fateful meeting at the Sacramento train depot. The labor was long and exhausting but ultimately uncomplicated, with Margaret serving as midwife and several of the ranch women coming to help. James paced outside the cottage for hours, nearly wearing a path in the dirt, until Margaret finally emerged with a grin and told him he had a son. James burst into the cottage to find Helena propped up in bed, exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in a soft blanket. The baby was red-faced and squalling, but when James carefully took him from Helena, the infant immediately quieted, staring up at his father with unfocused dark eyes. "A son," James said, his voice choked with emotion. "Helena, we have a son. He is perfect. You are perfect. I love you so much." "I love you too," Helena said, tears streaming down her face. "We made a person, James. A whole entire person. How incredible is that?" They named the baby Jacob Robert Jackson, after no one in particular, except that they both liked the name Jacob and wanted to honor Robert for his kindness and support. Little Jacob was a healthy baby with a strong set of lungs and an appetite that kept Helena exhausted for the first few weeks. But watching James with their son, seeing the wonder and devotion on his face every time he held the baby, made all the exhaustion worthwhile. Life with an infant was chaotic and challenging, but they adapted. Margaret was endlessly helpful, teaching Helena about babies and offering to take Jacob for a few hours here and there so Helena could sleep or catch up on work. James proved to be a devoted father, happy to walk the floor with a fussy baby at all hours and to change diapers without complaint. As Jacob grew from infant to baby to toddler, Helena and James settled into their roles as parents. They had the fights and frustrations common to any couple raising a child, the sleepless nights and the worry, and the sheer exhaustion of keeping a small person alive and thriving. But they also had the joys, the first smile and the first laugh and the first wobbly steps. They had the satisfaction of watching their son grow healthy and happy, surrounded by love and community. When Jacob was 2, Helena found herself pregnant again. This pregnancy was easier because she knew what to expect. And their second child, a daughter they named Hannah Margaret after both her great-grandmothers, arrived on a warm spring morning with considerably less drama than her brother's birth. Hannah was a calmer baby than Jacob had been, content to observe the world with serious dark eyes and only crying when she genuinely needed something. The cottage began to feel small with 4 people in it, so James and some of the other ranch hands spent their spare time that summer building an addition, 2 more bedrooms and a larger living space. Helena felt almost guilty about the extra room, remembering the boarding house in Sacramento, where she had been crowded into a tiny space and told to be grateful for it. Now here she was with a house that kept growing to accommodate her family, with people who wanted to help make her comfortable. "You deserve this," James told her one evening as they surveyed the nearly finished addition. "You deserve every good thing, Helena. A home big enough for our growing family, people who love and respect you, work that fulfills you. Stop feeling guilty for being happy." "I am trying," Helena said. "It is just sometimes I remember where I was 3 years ago, how hopeless everything seemed, and I can hardly believe this is my life now." "Believe it," James said, pulling her close. "This is your life, our life, and it is only going to get better." And it did get better, year by year. Jacob and Hannah grew, healthy and loved, surrounded by the extended family of the ranch. Helena's sewing business thrived, and she saved enough to buy a new machine and better supplies. James continued his work with the horses, and eventually realized his dream of buying a small piece of property adjacent to the Circle R, where he and Helena could build their own ranch while still working closely with Robert. They added a 3rd child to their family when Hannah was 3. A son they named Joshua, who proved to be the most adventurous of the 3, constantly getting into everything and giving his parents heart attacks with his fearless climbing and exploring. By the time Joshua was born, Helena and James had been married for 7 years and had settled into a partnership that was as much friendship as romance, though they still made time for each other, despite the chaos of raising 3 children. Robert and Margaret aged gracefully, eventually turning over more and more of the ranch operations to James and the other senior hands. They treated Helena and James's children like their own grandchildren, spoiling them appropriately and teaching them about the ranch and the land. Margaret taught Hannah to sew when the girl showed interest, and Robert taught Jacob to ride and work with cattle. The years rolled by with the inevitable challenges and triumphs. There were hard winters and dry summers, sick animals and accidents, the death of old Pete and the hiring of new young hands. Jacob grew tall and strong like his father, eventually taking on more responsibility around the ranch. Hannah proved to have her mother's eye for design and her father's head for business, and there were already discussions about her taking over Helena's sewing enterprise when she was old enough. Joshua remained the wild child, happiest when he was outdoors exploring, talking about becoming a geologist or adventurer. Through it all, Helena and James's love remained the steady foundation on which everything else was built. They had arguments and disagreements, of course, small tensions that flared and then resolved as they learned to navigate life together. But underneath, everything was the bone-deep certainty that they belonged together, that finding each other had been the best thing to happen to either of them. On their 10th wedding anniversary, James surprised Helena with a trip back to Sacramento. She had not been back to the city since that humiliating day at the train station, had no desire to revisit that part of her past. But James insisted, saying there was something he wanted her to see. They left the children with Margaret and took the train, Helena noting with grim satisfaction that no conductor dared to comment on her size or suggest she needed 2 seats. She was expensively dressed now in clothes she had made herself, confident and comfortable, and she carried herself like a woman who knew her worth. The conductor was nothing but respectful, and Helena felt a small private victory in that. In Sacramento, James led her to the train depot where they had first met. It looked exactly the same, the platform and the tracks and the ticket office. Helena stood there remembering how she had felt that day, how small and worthless and hopeless. It seemed like another lifetime, another person entirely. "You remember standing here?" James asked softly. "Of course," Helena said. "How could I forget? It was the worst day of my life and the best day of my life all mixed together." "I want you to know something," James said, taking both her hands in his. "That conductor who humiliated you, who told you that you were too big and did not belong, he was wrong. There was nothing wrong with you. The failing was his and the world's, not yours. You were always worthy of respect and kindness and love. I am just grateful that I was there that day, that I got to be the one to offer you a ride in my wagon and a chance at something better." "Your wagon built for 2, Helena said with a smile, remembering his words that first day. "You said it could handle any load, even a half-ton of grain sacks." "And you were much better company than grain sacks," James replied with a grin. "Best cargo I ever hauled and the only one I never wanted to unload." Helena laughed and kissed him right there on the platform, not caring who saw or what they thought. She was not that terrified woman anymore, and this was not that terrible day. This was 10 years later, and she was happy and loved and successful. And no conductor or small-minded stranger could ever take that away from her. They spent the day in Sacramento, visiting the shops and seeing how the city had changed. Helena went to the boarding house where she had stayed, but it was under new management, and nobody there remembered her. She felt no need to reintroduce herself or explain who she had been. That scared girl trying to make herself invisible was gone, replaced by a woman who knew her value. On the train ride home, Helena leaned against James's shoulder and reflected on the improbable journey that had brought them together. If that conductor had not been cruel, if James had not been there at exactly the right moment with his kind heart and his freight wagon, if she had not been brave enough to accept his help, none of this would exist. She would not have her husband, her children, her home and community. Everything good in her life flowed from that single moment of connection. "What are you thinking about?" James asked, noticing her thoughtful expression. "Just about how much I love you," Helena said simply. "About how grateful I am that you saw me when nobody else would. About how one moment of kindness can change everything." "I am the grateful one," James said. "You gave me a reason to be better, to want more than just existing day to day. You gave me a family and a purpose and more happiness than I knew existed." "I love you, Helena Jackson, and I thank God every day for train conductors with no compassion and freight wagons with room for 2. They arrived back at the ranch as the sun was setting, painting the hills in gold and orange. The children came running to greet them, Jacob tall and serious at 12, Hannah pretty and determined at 9, and Joshua wild and laughing at 6. Robert and Margaret waved from the porch of the main house, and several of the ranch hands called out greetings as James guided the wagon to their cottage. Helena looked at all of it, her family and her home and her community, and felt a profound sense of contentment settle over her. This was her life, hard-won and deeply cherished. She had traveled from humiliation and despair to this place of love and belonging, and she would never take a single moment of it for granted. That night, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet, James and Helena sat on their porch in the comfortable chairs they had bought years ago. The stars blazed overhead in the clear country darkness, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called. James reached over and took Helena's hand, lacing their fingers together in the familiar gesture that still made her heart flutter. "Happy anniversary," he said softly. "Here is to 10 more years and 10 more after that, and as many as we are given together." "Happy anniversary," Helena echoed. "I love you, James. Thank you for building a life with me, for seeing me as I am and loving all of it." "Always," James promised. "From that first moment on the station platform until my last breath. You are my heart, Helena, my home." They sat together in the comfortable silence of long companionship, watching the stars wheel overhead and listening to the night sounds of the ranch. Inside the house, their children slept safely, and tomorrow would bring the familiar rhythms of work and family life. But for this moment, they were simply Helena and James, the woman who had been told she was too big and the cowboy who had met her with a wagon built for two, still choosing each other every single day. The years continued to unfold with the predictable joys and sorrows of any life. Jacob eventually married a sensible girl from a neighboring ranch and brought her home to work alongside him, building his own house on the property James had bought. Hannah did indeed take over the sewing business, expanding it into a small storefront in the nearest town, and making a name for herself as a designer of simple, elegant clothing. Joshua followed his wandering heart to college, becoming a surveyor and explorer while always returning home between adventures. Helena and James grew older together, their hair graying and their bodies slowing but their love remaining constant. They became grandparents multiple times over, taking joy in the next generation while also appreciating the return of their evenings to peaceful quiet. Robert and Margaret passed within months of each other, both having lived full, long lives, and James inherited the Circle R along with the responsibility of keeping it thriving for the next generation. On their 25th wedding anniversary, James surprised Helena with a silver locket containing tiny photographs of all three of their children. She cried when she opened it, overwhelmed by the beauty of the gift and the weight of all those years together. "I cannot believe it has been 25 years, she said, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief Hannah had embroidered for her. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday that I was standing on that platform in Sacramento, certain my life was over. And I was thanking God for putting me in the right place at the right time," James added. "Best decision I ever made, offering you a ride in that freight wagon, changed the entire course of my life." "Changed both our lives," Helena corrected. "I was so scared that day, James. So certain that I would never be loved or wanted, that I was destined to be alone because I was too big, too much, too different. And then you appeared and showed me that none of that mattered, that the right person would see past all the surface things to who I really was. The right person just had to have good enough eyes to see clearly," James said. "And I have always had excellent vision when it comes to you. I saw strength and courage and kindness, and I knew I wanted that in my life. I have never regretted it for a single moment." They hosted a party that evening, all their children and grandchildren gathering along with the extended ranch family that had become their community. There was food and music and laughter, and Helena found herself surrounded by love in a way that would have been unimaginable to that scared young woman on the train platform. She had built this life with James by her side, had created family and home and belonging out of nothing but determination and hope. Later that night, Lying in bed in the cottage that had been expanded and improved so many times, it barely resembled the simple structure they had first moved into. James pulled Helena close. "You know what I think about sometimes," he said into the darkness. "What? That conductor. I wonder if he ever thinks about that day, about the woman he humiliated and turned away. I wonder if he has any idea what he set in motion, how his cruelty led to something so beautiful." "I doubt he remembers," Helena said honestly. "I was probably just one of many people he was cruel to that day. But I hope somewhere in his life he learned to be kinder, to see people as more than just their appearance or their inconvenience to him." "You are more generous than I am," James said. "I still want to punch him in the face." Helena laughed, the sound warm in the darkness. "My fierce protector." "But there is no need for violence, James. He lost nothing by turning me away, but I gained everything. I got you, and our children, and this beautiful life. If anything, I should thank him for being cruel enough to drive me into your arms." "That is a very mature and enlightened perspective," James said. "But I still maintain that the man is a coward and a fool, and I am allowed to think so even if you have forgiven him." "Fair enough," Helena agreed. "You can hold the grudge for both of us." They fell asleep wrapped together as always, and Helena dreamed of trains and wagons and the strange paths that led people to their destinies. She dreamed of a younger version of herself, scared and hurt but brave enough to accept help from a stranger. She dreamed of James as he had been that day, a cowboy with kind eyes and a wagon built for freight, offering salvation without expectation of reward. When she woke in the morning, James was already up and making coffee in the kitchen. She joined him, and they sat together at the table they had built themselves years ago, drinking their coffee and planning the day ahead. It was ordinary and perfect, this life they had created, full of small moments of connection and love that added up to something extraordinary. More years passed, measured in seasons and harvests and the growth of grandchildren into young adults. Helena's body aged, her joints stiffening and her energy declining, but James never treated her as though she was fragile or diminished. He remained her partner in all things, adapting as they both slowed down but never losing sight of the bond between them. When Helena turned 55, James threw her a surprise party that brought together people from all over the region. Former customers, neighbors, friends they had accumulated over decades. Helena was overwhelmed by the turnout, by the evidence of how many lives she had touched with her kindness, and her skill, and her simple determination to treat people with respect and dignity. "You are well loved," James whispered to her as they watched people mingle and laugh in their garden. "Not because of anything you do, though you do so much for everyone, but because of who you are. People are drawn to your warmth and your strength and your generous heart. I am just one of many who have been blessed by knowing you." "You are not just one of many," Helena said firmly. "You are my heart, James Jackson. You were the first person to see me as something other than a burden or a joke, and you have spent 30 years proving that you meant it. Everything good in my life comes from you." "Then we are equally blessed," James said, kissing her temple, "because everything good in my life comes from you." They continued to age together, their bodies slowing but their minds sharp and their love undiminished. Jacob took over more and more of the ranch operations, and eventually James and Helena transitioned to advisory roles, offering guidance but letting the younger generation make the decisions. It was strange at first, stepping back from work that had defined them for decades, but they found new rhythms and new ways to be useful. Helena spent more time with her grandchildren, teaching them to sew and telling them stories about the old days. James continued to work with horses when his body allowed, unable to fully give up the work that had sustained him. They took trips when they could, visiting Joshua, wherever his work took him, and exploring places they had always talked about seeing. On their 40th wedding anniversary, Jacob and Hannah insisted on organizing a major celebration. It was held at the ranch, now officially known as the Circle R. Jackson Ranch after the merger of Robert's original property with James's addition. Over 100 people attended, testament to the community the family had built and maintained. James stood to give a toast, his hair white now but his eyes still bright with life and humor. 40 years ago today, he said, his voice carrying across the assembled guests, I married the love of my life in a simple ceremony right here on this ranch. Helena was a woman who had been told her entire life that she was too much, too big, too different. She had been rejected and humiliated and made to feel like she did not deserve happiness or love. And then she met me, a cowboy with a freight wagon who saw what everyone else had missed, that she was extraordinary, strong, kind, brave, and beautiful. I offered her a ride in my wagon built for two, and she took a chance on me despite having every reason to distrust kindness from strangers. He paused, looking at Helena with such obvious adoration that several people in the audience wiped their eyes. That decision changed both our lives completely. We built this life together, raised 3 incredible children, and created a family and community that gives me pride every single day. Helena, you have made me happier than I ever thought possible. You have been my partner, my friend, my lover, my conscience, my inspiration. I thank God every day for putting me in that Sacramento depot at exactly the right moment. I love you more now than I did 40 years ago, which I would not have thought possible but is absolutely true. Here is to 40 more years, though I fear my body will not cooperate. But whatever time we have left, I want to spend every moment of it loving you. There was not a dry eye in the crowd as James sat down and Helena kissed him, both of them crying happy tears. Their children hugged them, and their grandchildren clustered around, and Helena felt a profound sense of completion. This was what she had been meant for all along, this life of love and family and community. All the pain and rejection of her youth had been leading her to that moment on the train platform, to James and his freight wagon and the beautiful future they had built together. They did not get 40 more years. James passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 79, a year after their 42nd anniversary. Helena held his hand as he slipped away, whispering how much she loved him and thanking him for the life they had shared. His last words were, "Love you, Helena. Always." And then he was gone, leaving a hole in her life that could never be filled. The ranch rallied around Helena in her grief, Jacob and his family moving into the cottage to ensure she was never alone. Hannah visited weekly, and Joshua came home from his latest expedition and stayed for 2 months. They told stories about James, remembering his kindness and his humor and his unshakable devotion to the people he loved. Slowly, painfully, Helena learned to live without him, carrying her grief but not being crushed by it. She threw herself into work, taking on new sewing projects and teaching her granddaughters the skills Margaret had taught her so many years ago. She became the family matriarch, the source of wisdom and stories about the old days. She never remarried, never even considered it, because James had been the love of her life and nobody could ever replace him. But she was not sad, not really. She had loved and been loved completely, had built a life of meaning and connection, had raised children who were good people and seen them raise good children of their own. She had taken the raw material of rejection and humiliation and transformed it into something beautiful through sheer determination and the blessing of meeting the right person at the right time. Helena lived to be 83 years old, dying peacefully in the same cottage where she had spent her married life. Her children and grandchildren surrounded her in those final days, and she told them stories about their grandfather, about the cowboy who had seen past her size to the woman beneath, who had offered her passage in his freight wagon and changed her life forever. "Never let anyone tell you that you are too much," she told her granddaughters in particular. "Never shrink yourself to make others comfortable. Take up all the space you need and find someone who celebrates that rather than trying to diminish it. That is what your grandfather did for me, and it made all the difference." Her last words were, "I am coming, James. Wait for me." And then she too was gone, reunited with her love wherever the next adventure led. The family buried her next to James on a hill overlooking the ranch, under a pair of oak trees they had planted together decades earlier. The headstone was simple but perfect. Helena Vance Jackson, beloved wife, mother, and grandmother, she was never too big, only perfectly herself. And if you visited that hill on a quiet evening, when the sun was setting and the ranch below was settling in for the night, you might almost see them, a big woman and a lean cowboy, holding hands and looking out over the life they built together, still in love after all these years, still choosing each other every single day. Because some love stories do not end with death. They continue on, written in the lives of the children and grandchildren left behind, in the family and community built from nothing but hope and courage, and one freight wagon with room for two. The ranch continued to thrive under Jacob's leadership, and Hannah's design business grew into something her mother would have been proud of. Joshua eventually settled down, returning to the family ranch with a wife and children of his own. They told stories about Helena and James to the next generation, ensuring that the love story that had started with humiliation and a kind offer of help would never be forgotten. And somewhere, perhaps, in whatever comes after this life, a cowboy and the woman he loved walked hand in hand through fields of gold, still together, still in love, having built something that would last long after they were both gone. Because that is what the best love stories do. They create ripples that extend far beyond the original moment, touching lives and changing futures in ways both large and small. The train conductor had said she was too big. The cowboy had met her with a wagon built for two. And together, they had proven that love sees no size, no limitation, no boundary that cannot be crossed when two hearts decide to beat as one. That was the legacy they left behind, and it was worth more than all the gold in California.